The wind in Wyoming territory did not simply blow, it hunted. It came screaming down from the jagged spine of the Bighorn Mountains, tearing across the high plains with a hunger that stripped the paint from clapboard houses and drove the grit deep into the lines of men's faces. The town of Granite Springs sat huddled in a shallow bowl of land, a scattering of false front buildings clinging to the earth as if afraid the gale might sweep them into the abyss. It was a hard place, built of rough-hewn timber and stubborn hope, situated miles from the nearest railhead and an eternity from civilization. In the summer, the heat rose in shimmering waves that distorted the horizon, and dust devils danced like angry spirits down the rutted main street. In the winter, the cold was a physical weight, a crushing presence that froze water in the basin and turned breath to ice before it left the lips. Sickness here was not an interruption of life, but a constant companion. A broken leg on a distant ranch could mean death by exposure or gangrene. A fever in a child was a coin toss with the devil. Between the homesteaders and the grave stood only one man, and he was dying. Dr. Nathaniel Hale rode his mare, Bess, into the edge of town just as the sun began to bleed crimson against the western peaks. It had been a long, brutal day, the kind that made a man of 40 feel 60. At dawn, he had been 12 miles out at the Miller homestead, pulling a breech calf from a heifer because the family could not afford to lose the livestock. Then, tending to Mrs. Miller's sprained wrist. By noon, he was setting a compound fracture for a miner who had been kicked by a mule, the bone gleaming white and terrible through the torn flesh. Now, the evening chill was setting in, biting through his wool coat. Nate slumped in the saddle, his body swaying with the mare's gait. He was a tall man, or he had been before the stoop of exhaustion claimed his shoulders. His face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp as flint under a beard that was graying prematurely. Beneath his coat, his chest felt heavy, as if he were breathing through wet wool. He pulled up in front of his clinic, a lean-to structure tacked onto a modest 2-room house at the end of the street. Dismounting was a calculated effort. He gripped the pommel, took a breath that rattled deep in his lungs, and swung his leg over. His boots hit the frozen mud with a thud that sent a shock of pain up his spine. Inside, the clinic was cold and smelled of carbolic acid, dried sage, and old paper. Nate lit the oil lamp on his desk, his hands shaking slightly until the flame caught and bathed the room in a sickly yellow light. He did not remove his coat immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a handkerchief. He pressed it to his mouth and coughed, a wet, tearing sound that echoed in the silence of the empty house. When he pulled the cloth away, the white linen was speckled with bright, fresh red. Nate stared at the blood for a long moment, his expression detached, clinical. He folded the handkerchief carefully, hiding the stain, and placed it back in his pocket. From the bottom drawer of his desk, he retrieved a small amber bottle of laudanum. He uncorked it, the bitter smell rising to meet him, and took a measured swallow. It was a dangerous crutch, he knew, but it was the only thing that dulled the fire in his chest enough to let him sleep. He sat at his desk, opened his ledger, and dipped his pen in the inkwell, in the same precise, looping script he used to record births and deaths. He wrote the date, November 12th, 1887. Beneath it, he noted his own symptoms. Hemoptysis continues. Fever mild but persistent. Weight loss significant. Breath sounds diminished in upper left lobe. He closed the book. There was no point in deluding himself. He had seen enough consumption to know the progression. The town whispered that he was a walking ghost, and for once, the gossip was accurate. He stood and walked into the living quarters. The house was clean but soulless, filled with the silence of people who were gone. On the mantel, a photograph in a silver frame gathered dust. It was a tintype of a woman with laughing eyes and hair pulled back in a severe style that could not hide her warmth. Elizabeth. She had been dead for 6 years. Nate ran a finger along the edge of the frame. Beside it, tucked into a drawer he rarely opened, lay a pair of knitted wool booties, white as new snow. They had never been worn. Elizabeth had died bringing their son into the world, and the boy had followed her before he took his first breath. The silence in the house was not just the absence of a noise, it was the absence of the future. Nate looked at his hands, scarred and stained with ink and iodine. He had saved hundreds of lives in this valley, yet he had failed to save the two that mattered most. The townspeople pitied him, but they also feared him. A doctor who could not heal his own family seemed bad luck, a man cursed by God. 3 streets away, the Drover's Rest Saloon was just waking up. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. A piano player in the corner hammered out a tinny, cheerful tune that clashed with the grim faces of the men lining the bar. Maria Elena Morales moved through the crowd like a shadow. She carried a tray loaded with whiskey glasses, her movements fluid and efficient. She was 24 years old, with skin the color of polished copper and hair so dark it swallowed the lamplight. Her mother had been Mexican, her father Arapaho, and in the eyes of Granite Springs, that made her something less than human. She was tainted, a creature of 2 worlds who belonged to neither. "Hey, girl, bring that bottle here," a miner shouted, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. Lena twisted away with a practiced motion, not spilling a drop of the whiskey. "The bottle is coming, sir," she said, her voice low and even. She kept her eyes down. Eye contact was dangerous. It invited things she could not afford to refuse and did not want to accept. She set the drinks down at a poker table, ignoring the crude comments about her figure and the laughter that followed. She had learned long ago that pride was a luxury she could not eat. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, a snatch of a song in Spanish, La Llorona, a melody about weeping and loss that felt stitched into her bones. A rancher's wife walked past the saloon's swinging doors on the street outside. Hurrying home before dark, she held the hand of a toddler, a little boy wrapped in a thick woolen coat. Lena paused, watching through the dirty glass of the window. Her hand went instinctively to her stomach, flat and empty beneath her apron. Memory washed over her, sharp as a knife. 2 years ago, the wagon train heading west, the pain starting in her back, the wagon master refusing to stop because they were behind schedule and water was scarce. She remembered the jolting of the wheels, the dust choking her screams, the way the world had narrowed to a single point of agony in a dry ditch while the wagons rolled on. She had buried the baby in a shallow grave marked only by a pile of stones. She had not even known if it was a boy or a girl. The grief was a hollow space inside her, a room she kept locked but visited every day. "Lena, quit dreaming and get those glasses washed," the saloon owner, a sweating man named Higgins, bellowed from behind the bar. Lena turned back to the room, her face a mask of calm. "Yes, Mr. Higgins," she said. She swallowed the rage, tasting it like bile, and plunged her hands into the bucket of cold, gray water. The storm hit 2 days later, in the middle of the afternoon. There was no warning, only a sudden, strange stillness. The birds stopped singing, the wind died. Then, the western horizon turned the color of dried blood. A wall of dust, thousands of feet high, swept toward the town, devouring the sun. "Dust storm!" someone shouted in the street. Shutters slammed. Horses whinnied in panic. In the saloon, the men scrambled to cover their drinks. Within minutes, day turned to a suffocating twilight. The air inside the Drover's Rest filled with a fine, stinging grit that tasted of sulfur and earth. Upstairs, in one of the small rooms rented out to travelers, a child began to scream. Lena was wiping down the bar when she heard it. It was a high, thin sound, terrified and pain-filled. She dropped her rag and ran for the stairs, ignoring Higgins' shout to stay put. She found the child, a girl of perhaps 6 years, thrashing on a narrow cot. Her parents, a pair of destitute travelers who had arrived yesterday, were nowhere to be found, likely at the general store or the smithy, trapped by the storm. The girl's skin was burning hot. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She was seizing, her small limbs jerking violently. "Hush, little one, hush," Lena murmured. panic rising in her throat. She touched the girl's forehead. It was like touching a stove. She ran to the landing. "Mr. Higgins, the girl is sick. She is burning up." Higgins looked up from the bar, a handkerchief pressed to his nose. "Not my problem. Lena, parents should be here." "She needs the doctor," Lena cried. "She is having fits." Higgins glanced at the window, where the dust was hammering against the glass like buckshot. "I am not going out in that," he growled. "A man could get turned around and choked to death in 5 minutes. Let her be till it passes." Lena looked back at the room where the child gasped for air. She thought of the stone pile in the ditch. She thought of the silence of a baby that never cried. "No," she whispered. She ran back into the room, grabbed a heavy wool shawl, and wrapped the child tight. She lifted the girl, staggering slightly under the weight, and covered both their heads with the fabric. "You are crazy!" Higgins shouted as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "You will die out there!" Lena did not answer. She kicked the door open and stepped into the maelstrom. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet. The noise was deafening, a roar that drowned out her own thoughts. The grit scoured her exposed skin, stinging like 1,000 wasps. She could not see more than 3 feet in front of her. She clutched the child closer, burying her face in the girl's shoulder, and pushed forward. She knew the town by feel. She counted the steps, past the livery stable, past the dry goods store. The dust coated her tongue, filling her nose. She squeezed her eyes shut, navigating by the memory of the boardwalk beneath her boots. The child in her arms was dead weight, twitching intermittently. "Please." Lena prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. "Not this one. Do not take this one." She slammed into a wall, the rough wood scraping her arm. She groped along it until she found a door handle. She turned it and fell inside, tumbling onto the floor of the clinic. The sudden silence was shocking. Nate was standing by the window, watching the storm, and he spun around as the door burst open. He saw a heap of dusty skirts and dark hair on his floor. Clutching a bundle, he was beside her in a second. "What on earth? The girl!" Lena rasped, coughing up dust. She pulled the shawl back. "Fever, seizures." Nate's expression shifted instantly from shock to professional focus. He scooped the child from Lena's arms and carried her to the examination table. "Get the basin," he ordered, his voice crisp. "Pump water." "There is a cloth in the drawer. Hurry!" Lena scrambled up, her exhaustion forgotten. She found the basin and pumped the handle in the corner kitchen, her hands shaking. She brought the water to the table. Nate was leaning over the girl, listening to her chest. "High fever," he muttered. "Convulsions brought on by heat spikes. We need to cool her down." He dipped the cloth in the water and began to wipe the child's face and neck. "Hold her steady," he told Lena. Lena moved to the other side of the table. She gripped the girl's small shoulders, pinning her gently as another seizure rippled through the tiny body. She began to sing, soft and low, the same Spanish lullaby she hummed in the saloon. Her voice was steady, a lifeline in the dim room. Nate glanced up. His eyes met hers over the child's heaving chest. For a second, the doctor and the saloon girl vanished. There were only 2 people fighting death. He saw the fierce determination in her dark eyes, the way her hands did not tremble despite the dust coating her skin. He saw a competence that matched his own. "Keep singing," Nate said softly. "It is helping." They worked for hours. The storm raged outside, burying the town in red silt, but inside the circle of lamplight, time seemed to stop. Nate administered a small dose of willow bark tincture. Lena changed the cool cloths, replacing them as soon as they grew warm. They moved around each other in the cramped space with an instinctive rhythm, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Finally, the girl's breathing deepened. The heat radiating from her skin began to recede. She stopped twitching and slipped into a natural sleep. Nate exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. He slumped back against the counter, wiping sweat and dust from his forehead. His hand went to his chest, rubbing the sternum absently. "She will live," he said. Lena slumped onto a stool, her legs suddenly turning to water. Gracias a Dios, she whispered. Nate looked at her. Really looked at her. He had seen her around town. Of course, the woman the church ladies crossed the street to avoid. He had assumed she was hard, brittle, like the other women who survived the frontier by selling pieces of themselves. But the woman sitting in his clinic, covered in dust, looked only tired and terrifyingly young. You brought her through the storm, Nate said. It wasn't a question. That was a foolish thing to do. Lena raised her chin, a spark of defiance returning. Mr. Higgins would not help. She was dying. You could have died, Nate said. People get lost 2 yards from their front door in this weather. Then we would have died together, she said simply. Nate was silent for a moment. He turned to the stove, where a kettle sat. He lit the burner. Do you drink tea, Miss Morales? Lena blinked, surprised. Yes, sometimes. Chamomile, Nate said. It settles the nerves. He made the tea in silence. The clink of china loud in the quiet room. He handed her a cup, the china delicate and mismatched. Survivors of a set that had once been whole. Thank you, Doctor, she said, wrapping her hands around the warmth. Nate, he corrected gently. My name is Nate. He sat opposite her. Where are you from? Lena? Before here, she hesitated. No one in Granite Springs asked her questions unless they wanted something dirty. But Nate's gray eyes were curious, lacking the predatory glint she was used to. New Mexico, she said. Then, everywhere. My father was a scout. My mother washed clothes for the fort. A hard life, Nate said. A life, she countered. Better than some. Why did you risk it? For a stranger's child. Lena looked down into her tea. The steam rose, curling like a ghost. Because a child should not be alone in the dark, she said softly. And because no one else would. Nate watched her, a strange ache unfolding in his chest. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. He saw a loneliness in her that mirrored his own. A vast, empty prairie where the wind never stopped blowing. You have a healer's hands, he said unexpectedly. Lena looked at her hands, red, chapped, stained with saloon work. She curled them into fists. They are just hands. Doctor. Nate, he reminded her. Nate. She tested the name. It felt heavy and light at the same time. They sat there while the storm blew itself out, sipping tea as the dust settled on the windowsill. It was a small, quiet intimacy, fragile as a bird's wing, but for the first time in years, the clinic did not feel entirely like a tomb. The weather turned a week later. The dust was replaced by a bitter, biting cold that signaled the true arrival of winter. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue during the day and a vault of freezing stars at night. It was late, past midnight, when Lena left the Drover's Rest. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her breath puffed white in the air. The boardwalk creaked under her boots, the wood shrinking in the frost. She turned into the alley behind the saloon, a shortcut to the boarding house where she rented a drafty room. The shadows were deep here, blue-black and sharp. Well now, if it ain't the little nurse. Lena froze. Caleb, a ranch hand from the Double Bar outfit, stepped out from behind a stack of crates. He was big, heavy with muscle and fat, and he smelled of cheap whiskey and chewing tobacco. He had been eyeing her all night, making lewd gestures that she had studiously ignored. Good night, Caleb, Lena said, keeping her voice steady. She tried to step around him. He moved to block her path. You think you're special now, don't you? He sneered. Running to the doctor's house, playing the lady. Let me pass, Lena said, her hand going to the small knife she kept in her pocket. I don't think so. Caleb lunged, his hand clamped onto her arm like a bear trap. Lena cried out, twisting violently. She kicked at his shin, but her boot just glanced off his heavy leather chaps. He laughed, a wet, ugly sound, and slammed her back against the wall of the saloon. You ain't too good for me, he hissed, his face inches from hers. You're just a half-breed whore, and it's time you learned your place. Get off me, Lena screamed, the sound tearing through the icy air. She clawed at his face, her nails raking his cheek. Caleb roared in anger and raised a fist to strike her. Suddenly, footsteps pounded on the frozen earth at the mouth of the alley. "Let her go!" The voice was ragged but commanding. Caleb turned his head, distracted. Lena saw Nate standing there. He was returning from a late call, his medical bag in one hand, his coat hanging loosely on his frame. "Walk away, sawbones." Caleb spat. "This ain't your business." "I said let her go." Nate stepped forward, dropping his bag. Caleb shoved Lena aside. She fell to the hard ground, scraping her palms. The big man turned toward Nate, fists raised. "You want to play hero, old man? Come on then." Nate did not have the strength to fight. His lungs were already burning from the cold air, his body depleted by the day's work. But he did not back down. He stepped between Caleb and Lena, placing himself as a shield. "Go home, Caleb," Nate said, his voice tight. "You are drunk." Caleb swung. It was a clumsy, looping punch, but it carried the weight of a 200-pound man. It caught Nate on the jaw. Nate's head snapped back. He staggered, losing his footing on the ice, and went down hard. Pain exploded in his face, but worse was the shock to his chest. The impact jarred his lungs, triggering a spasm that he couldn't control. Caleb raised his boot to kick the fallen doctor. "Hey!" The sheriff's voice boomed from the street. "What in the hell is going on here?" Sheriff Miller and his deputy came running, drawn by the noise. Caleb froze, his foot hovering. Miller grabbed the ranch hand by the collar and hurled him against the wall. "You drunk fool," Miller growled, cuffing Caleb's hands. "Assaulting the doctor? I ought to hang you." Lena scrambled on her hands and knees toward Nate. He was curled on his side in the snow, his body convulsing. He wasn't just coughing, he was retching, his whole frame shaking with the violence of it. "Nate," Lena touched his shoulder. "Nate, are you all right?" He couldn't answer. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He pressed the handkerchief to his mouth, but it wasn't enough. Under the weak light of the alley lamp, Lena saw it. Dark, arterial blood was seeping through his fingers, running down his chin, dripping onto the pristine white snow. It bloomed there like terrible flowers, bright and shocking. Nate took a wheezing breath, his eyes wide and panicked, fixed on the stars above. He looked fragile, like dry timber ready to snap. The blood on his lips was stark against his pale skin. He lowered his hand slowly. He didn't try to hide it this time. He looked at Lena, and in his gaze, she saw the truth he had kept hidden behind his ledger and his silence. He wasn't just sick. He was finished. The man who had saved the town, who had saved the little girl, who had just stepped in front of a fist for her, was dying, and he was doing it entirely alone. "Doctor," Lena whispered, the word catching in her throat. Sheriff Miller dragged Caleb away, cursing, but Lena didn't watch them go. She reached out and took Nate's hand. It was ice cold. She used her own apron to wipe the blood from his chin, her touch gentle, ignoring the tremors in her own hands. "I have you," she said softly, though she didn't know what good it would do. "I have you." Nate closed his eyes, his chest heaving as the fit subsided into a rattling wheeze. For a moment, he didn't pull away. He let her hold his hand. He let himself be weak. That night, Lena sat on the steps of the saloon long after the doors were locked. The cold seeped through her thin dress, but she didn't move. She stared at the empty street where the blood had stained the snow. She felt a confusing storm rising in her heart. Gratitude, certainly. Fear, yes, for him, and for herself without him. But beneath it all was something dangerous, something she had thought dead and buried in a ditch 2 years ago. It was longing, not just to be safe, but to be near him, to be the one who wiped the blood away, to stand between him and the cold, just as he had stood between her and the fist. No one had risked themselves for her in a long time, perhaps never. She shivered, but not from the cold. The wind howled down from the mountains, lonely and fierce, But for the first time, Lena Morales did not feel entirely like a leaf blown before it. She had a direction now. The doctor was dying, and she would not let him do it alone. The morning sun that bled through the thin curtains of the clinic was not a comfort. It was an accusation. Nate woke with a gasp, his chest feeling as though it had been packed with wet sand. Every breath was a negotiation with his own lungs. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the narrow cot he kept in the back room, and the room tilted alarmingly. His skin was hot, dry, and tight, the fever from the previous night having burned itself down to a smoldering coal deep in his bones. He reached for the wash basin, splashing cold water onto his face. The shock of it cleared the fog from his mind, but it did nothing for the tremor in his hands. He looked at them, long, slender fingers that had set bones and stitched arteries, and saw them shaking like autumn leaves in a gale. Outside, Granite Springs was already awake. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer rang out against the cold air, and wagons rattled over the frozen ruts of Main Street. But beneath the usual noise, there was a different kind of hum. Nate could feel it when he stepped out to check on his mare. "Bess!" Men tip-ticked their hats with a little more deference than usual, and women whispered behind their hands as he passed. The fight in the alley. It had traveled faster than a prairie fire. Sheriff Miller stopped by just before noon. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that looked like a push broom, and he stood in the doorway of the clinic, turning his hat in his hands. "Morning, Doc," Miller said, eyeing Nate with a mixture of respect and frustration. "You look like hell warmed over." "Thank you, Sheriff. I feel somewhat similar," Nate replied, measuring out a powder for a rancher's wife who had the dropsy. He kept his back to the door to hide the bloodless pallor of his face. "Caleb is cooling his heels in the cell," Miller said. "He will likely be there a few days until the judge rides through. But I came to give you a piece of advice." Nate, friendly-like. Nate turned, corking the bottle. "I am listening." "You did a good thing last night. No man should strike a woman," Miller said, shifting his weight. "But folks are talking. They say you are mixing with the wrong sort. That Morales girl. She is saloon stock. Nate, mixed blood. Trouble follows her like a shadow. You standing between her and a drunk cowhand? That is one thing, but do not go thinking you can save her. You will only pull trouble down on your own head." Nate felt a flash of irritation, hot and sharp. "She is a human being, Sheriff, and she has a name." Miller put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. "Just a warning, Doc, you have enough battles to fight without taking on the town's prejudices, too." When the sheriff left, Nate slumped into his chair, the energy draining out of him as if a plug had been pulled. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that left him dizzy. He pulled the handkerchief away and saw the familiar red stain. It was getting worse. The sheriff was right about one thing. He had enough battles. He looked around the clinic. Bottles needed washing. Bandages needed rolling. The floor was tracked with a mud. He had 3 house calls to make this afternoon. Miles of riding in the biting wind. He realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that he could not do this anymore. Not alone. He was dying, and the work was killing him faster than the disease. He closed his eyes and saw the alley again. He saw Lena's face in the lamplight, not the hardness of a woman who survived on tips and groping hands, but the terror and the fierce, quiet competence she had shown during the dust storm. He remembered her hands, steady and sure as they held the feverish child. He remembered the bruises blooming on her wrists from Caleb's grip. She needed safety. He needed time. The idea formed slowly, practical and desperate. It was a transaction, he told himself. Nothing more. Nate walked into the Drover's Rest Saloon at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In the daylight, the place looked stripped of its nocturnal magic. The sunlight streaming through the dirty windows illuminated the floating dust motes, the stained floorboards, and the scarred wood of the bar. The air smelled stale, a mixture of old tobacco, spilled beer, and despair. The few patrons, old men nursing cheap whiskey and a couple of drifters playing cards, looked up in surprise. The doctor did not come here. Nate ignored them. He spotted Lena near the back, sweeping sawdust into a pile. She wore a faded gray dress, her hair tied back severely, her face guarded. When she saw him, she paused, her grip tightening on the broom handle. He walked over to her, removing his hat. "Miss Morales." "Doctor," she said, her voice low. She glanced toward the bar where Higgins, the owner, was wiping glasses. "You should not be here, mister. Higgins does not like respectable folk causing a scene." "I'm not here to cause a scene," Nate said. "I would like to speak with you, privately." Lena hesitated, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw the fatigue etched into the lines around his mouth, the way he leaned slightly against a table for support. "There is a table in the corner," she said finally. They sat. The distance between them felt vast, bridged only by the memory of the alley and the storm. "I have a proposition for you," Nate began, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. "I find myself in need of assistance. My practice is busy, and my health is, as you have noticed, failing. I need someone to keep the house, cook meals, and assist me in the clinic, cleaning instruments, preparing medicines, helping with patients." Lena stared at him, her face unreadable. "You want me to be your maid?" "I want you to be my housekeeper and my assistant," Nate corrected. "I can offer you room and board. The house is small, but the back room is warm, and I can pay you $5 a week." $5 was a fortune compared to the pennies she scraped together here. But Lena did not smile. She had heard offers from men before. They always started with work and ended with a hand on her thigh and a demand for gratitude. "And what else?" she asked, her voice hard. "What else does the $5 buy? Doctor, a warm bed warmer?" Nate flinched, the color rising in his pale cheeks. "No," he said firmly. "I am offering you a job. Miss Morales, nothing more. My wife passed some years ago. I have no intention of disrespecting her memory or your dignity. You would have your own room. A lock on the door if you wish." He leaned forward slightly, and the professional mask slipped. Lena saw the desperation in his gray eyes. It wasn't the hunger of a man who wanted sex. It was the terror of a man who knew the dark was coming. "I cannot do it alone anymore," he whispered. "I need help, and I believe you have the hands for it." Lena looked at the sawdust on the floor. She looked at the bar where Higgins was watching them with a sneer. She thought of the drunken hands, the crude jokes, the constant fear of the alley. Then she looked at Nate's hands, resting on the table. They were trembling. "I will not be a whore," she said quietly. "Not for you. Not for anyone. I would never ask it of you," Nate said. She stood up. She walked over to the bar, untying her apron. "What do you think you are doing?" Higgins barked. "I am quitting," Lena said. She dropped the dirty apron on the bar. "I am done." "You walk out that door. You don't come back," Higgins shouted, his face turning red. "You think that half-dead doctor is going to keep you? He will tire of you in a week and throw you out on the street." Lena lifted her chin. "Then I will be on the street," she said. "But I will not be here." She went upstairs, packed her single small trunk, and walked out of the saloon. She did not look back. The doctor's house was at the edge of town, where the street dissolved into the open prairie. It was a sturdy structure, built of timber that had weathered to silver gray, with a roof that sagged slightly in the middle like a tired saddle. When Lena stepped inside with her trunk, the silence hit her first. It was not the empty silence of the abandoned, but the heavy, curated silence of a museum. The front room served as a parlor and dining area. One wall was lined with bookshelves, the leather spines cracked and worn. A clock on the mantel ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tock, tock, tock. Everything was neat. Everything was dusty. "The kitchen is through there," Nate said, gesturing vaguely. "Your room is off the kitchen. It used to be the pantry, but I expanded it." Lena walked through the rooms. She saw the ghost of a woman everywhere, A lace curtain on the window, yellowed with age but still delicate. A teacup with a hairline crack sitting on a shelf. Too precious to throw away but too broken to use. A pressed blue flower trapped between the pages of a book left on a side table. She felt like a thief. She was loud and colorful and tainted. And she was standing in the shrine of a good, dead woman. "It is quiet," she said. "Yes," Nate said. He was leaning against the door frame, looking exhausted by the walk from town. "I suppose it is." The first week was a dance of excruciating politeness. Nate treated her with a formal courtesy that bordered on absurdity. He knocked on the door frame before entering the kitchen. He apologized if he had to ask her to fetch water. He left his bedroom door wide open at night, a silent signal to her and the world that he was hiding nothing. Lena took to the work with a ferocity born of gratitude and fear. She scrubbed the floors until the wood bleached white. She polished the windows until the prairie light flooded in. She learned to cook the simple, bland stews that Nate's stomach could tolerate, but it was the clinic where she truly came alive. Nate began to teach her. At first, it was simple tasks, boiling instruments, rolling bandages, but soon he saw her watching him as he worked, her dark eyes absorbing every movement. "Come here," he said one afternoon, as a ranch hand sat with a deep gash in his forearm from a barbed wire fence. "Watch how I tie this." Lena stepped closer. The smell of blood and iodine was strong, but she did not flinch. "The knot must lie flat," Nate explained, his voice low and steady. "Too tight, and the skin dies. Too loose, and the wound gapes. It is a balance." He handed her the thread. "You try—" The ranch hand looked nervous. "Now wait a minute. Doc, be still." "Jim," Nate said. "She has steadier hands than I do today." It was true. Nate's hands were shaking with a low-grade fever. Lena took the needle. She bit her lip, focusing. She mimicked Nate's motion, looping the thread, pulling it gently, locking the knot. "Perfect," Nate said, and the surprise in his voice made Lena's chest swell with a strange heat. Again, by the end of the month, she knew the names of the instruments: scalpel, forceps, speculum. She knew how to count a pulse by watching the second hand on the big clock. She knew that blue lips meant the heart was failing and that a rigid belly meant something had burst inside. But the work was not confined to the clinic. The high plains were unforgiving, and sickness did not wait for fair weather. They rode out together into the teeth of the winter. Nate rode Bess, and Lena rode a stubborn mule Nate had acquired for her. They crossed creeks where the water was black and skimmed with ice, the horses slipping on the slick stones. They rode through sleet that stung like needles, aiming for distant plumes of smoke that marked isolated homesteads. Nate's cough worsened with every mile. The cold air seemed to crystallize in his lungs. Lena would watch him from the back of her mule, seeing the way he hunched over the saddle horn, his body racked with spasms. She saw him wipe blood from his lips before entering a patient's house, straightening his spine, forcing a smile he did not feel. He gave everything to them, to the mother with the colicky baby, to the old man with the crushed foot, to the child with the croup. He poured his dwindling life force into them, leaving nothing for himself. Anger began to grow in Lena. It was a hot, hard knot in her stomach. It was unfair. The saloon was full of men who beat their wives and cheated at cards, and they were healthy as oxen. Yet this man, this gentle, broken man who had given her a home and treated her like an equal, was being eaten alive by the earth itself. "Why do you do it?" she asked him one day as they rode back from the pitiful shack of a trapper who had died of gangrene before they arrived. "You are killing yourself for them, and half of them do not even pay you." Nate looked at the gray horizon, his eyes watery from the wind. "It is what I am. Lena, if I stop, I'm just a dying man waiting for the end. As long as I work, I am a doctor." One night in late December, the cold dropped so low that the timbers of the house groaned like living things. They had returned late from a difficult berth at the Parker Ranch, 10 miles out. Nate was gray with exhaustion, his lips blue. They stumbled into the kitchen. The fire in the stove had gone out hours ago. The room was freezing, the air biting at their exposed skin. I will get it," Nate chattered, his teeth clicking together. He reached for the box of lucifer matches on the shelf. He tried to strike one against the rough strip on the side of the box. His hand shook violently. The match head crumbled. He tried another. It snapped in half. He tried a third, his breathing coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He couldn't do it. He couldn't perform the simplest task to save himself. "Damn it," he whispered, a sob breaking through the words. "Damn it." Lena was there in an instant. She did not speak. She took the box from his trembling fingers. She struck a match, one clean, decisive motion. The flame flared, orange and bright. She lit the kindling in the stove, watching the fire catch. Then she turned to him. He was standing in the middle of the room, still wearing his heavy coat, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Lena grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the back of the rocking chair. She stepped close to him, closer than she had ever been. She threw the blanket around his shoulders and pulled it tight, her hands lingering on the rough wool. She looked up at him. The closeness was sudden and startling. She saw the sharp ridge of his collarbones jutting against his skin, the hollows of his temples, but she also saw his eyes. They were wide, dark, and burning with a sudden, intense heat that had nothing to do with fever. He looked at her mouth. For a heartbeat. The air in the kitchen crackled, hotter than the stove. Then Nate flinched. He stepped back, nearly tripping. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. I am sorry. I am very tired." He turned and fled into his bedroom, closing the door. Lena stood alone in the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs, the smell of sulfur and wet wool lingering in the air. The winter deepened, trapping them in the house for long evenings. The awkwardness slowly melted into a quiet companionship. They sat by the stove in the evenings, Nate reading medical journals, Lena mending clothes or studying the anatomy books he allowed her to borrow. They began to talk, not about the weather or the patients, but about the things that hurt. Nate spoke first, on a night when the wind was particularly mournful. He told her about Elizabeth. "It was a breech birth," he said, staring into the flames. "I tried to turn the baby. I thought I had time, but she started to bleed. I was the only doctor for 40 miles, and I couldn't stop it. I stood there with my hands covered in her blood, and I knew I had killed her." "You did not kill her," Lena said softly. "Nature killed her. You fought it." "I failed," Nate said. "I kept the booties. I do not know why. Punishment, perhaps." Lena was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice steady but thin as glass. "I had a baby. On the trail." Nate turned his head to look at her. 2 years ago," she said, "I was working for a family in the wagon train. The master. He was a hard man. We were behind schedule. When my pain started, he said I was lying to get out of walking. He would not stop the wagon." She took a breath, her hands clenching in her lap. "I walked until I fell. Then I crawled into a ditch. It was cold, not like tonight, but cold enough. The baby came, and it was silent. It never cried. I held it for an hour. Then I buried it under some rocks so the coyotes would not get it. And then I ran to catch up to the wagons." Nate reached out across the small space between their chairs. He took her hand. He did not say anything. He simply held it, his thumb tracing the rough skin of her knuckles. Their griefs hung in the air. Two ghosts that recognized each other. He had lost the future. She had lost the past. In that shared brokenness, the last barrier between them crumbled. They were no longer employer and servant. They were survivors clinging to the same piece of driftwood. It changed one evening in January. A blizzard had descended with the fury of a vengeful god. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the shingles. Snow drifted high against the windows, sealing the house in a white tomb. The fire in the stove was burning low, fighting a losing battle against the draft. Lena was in the kitchen, stacking the last of the firewood. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the house, a rare winter thunderstorm. Startled, Lena stumbled over a loose floorboard. She pitched forward. Nate was there. He caught her by the arms. His grip surprisingly strong. He pulled her upright, but the momentum carried her into him. They collided, her chest against his chest, her hands gripping his forearms. For a moment, neither of them moved. The thunder rolled away, leaving only the sound of their breathing. Nate's breath was ragged, wet, and labored. Lena's heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. She could see the gray in his beard, the fine lines of pain around his eyes. But beneath the illness, beneath the exhaustion, she saw the man. Desire flared, sudden, raw, and terrifying. It wasn't the polite affection of friends, it was a hunger. It was the biological imperative of life asserting itself in the face of death. Lena felt a pull in her belly that she hadn't felt in years, a longing to be held, to be warm, to be possessed by something other than grief. Nate looked at her lips. His hands tightened on her arms, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the want warring with the conscience. "Lena," he breathed. It was half a prayer, half a warning. Then he let go. He stepped back as if he had been burned, his hands dropping to his sides. Forgive me," he stammered, turning his face away. "I should not. I am sorry." "Do not be sorry," Lena whispered. "I must check the windows," Nate said, his voice tight and formal again. He practically ran into the parlor. That night, the house felt vast and empty. Nate lay in his bed, listening to the wind howl. He stared at the ceiling, his body aching with a specific, sharp loneliness. He wanted her. God help him. He wanted her. But he was dying. What right did a dying man have to touch a woman like her? She was young, vibrant, with a life ahead of her. He was a husk. If he touched her, he would only taint her further in the eyes of the town. He would be using her to warm his own cold grave. In the small back room, Lena lay curled under her quilt, shivering. She listened to Nate's coughing through the thin wall. She touched her own lips where his breath had brushed them. She told herself he was too good for her. He was a gentleman, a doctor, a man who belonged to the ghost in the lace curtains. She was Lena from the saloon. Lena with the illegitimate dead baby. Lena who was ruined, but as the wind screamed outside, trying to tear the world apart. They both imagined the same impossible thing. They imagined the wall between them vanishing. They imagined the warmth of skin on skin. The silence of the house filled not with ghosts, but with the quiet, desperate sounds of two people proving to each other that they were still alive. The rumors in Granite Springs did not spread like fire. They spread like rot, slow and damp and impossible to scrape away. It began with side glances when Lena rode into town on the mule to fetch flour or coffee, her head high but her knuckles white on the reins. It grew into silence that fell like a hammer whenever she walked into the general store. The women of the church, clad in their dark wool and rigid piety, crossed the street when they saw her coming, lifting their skirts as if the mud she walked on might stain their souls. They whispered that the Mexican girl was a vulture circling a dying animal. They said she was filling the doctor's head with heathen remedies and emptying his pockets while he was too weak to stop her. "It is unnatural, Mrs." Gable hissed to the Reverend's wife outside the post office, loud enough for Lena to hear. "A man in his condition, living with a woman like that. We all know what she is paying for her keep with." Lena kept walking, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the gray clouds met the white peaks. She had learned to build a fortress inside her own mind, a place where their words could not reach, but the walls were getting thin. One afternoon, Mr. Wallace, the owner of the dry goods store, made the threat plain. Lena was purchasing a bolt of flannel for bandages. Wallace leaned over the counter, his eyes hard and shiny like polished stones. "You best be careful with the doctor's credit, girl," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "He is not long for this world, and when he is gone, the law does not look kindly on squatters. You have no kin here, no claim. Once the breath leaves him, you will be back on the street before his body is cold." Lena took the flannel without a word, but his words followed her out into the biting wind. They echoed the fear that kept her awake at night. Not the fear of poverty, which she knew well enough, but the fear of erasure, the fear that her time in the house, the quiet evenings, the healing work, would be swept away as if they had never happened. Nate heard the truth of it 3 days later. He was at the barber's, indulging in the luxury of a hot towel and a shave because his hands had been shaking too badly to hold a razor that morning. The towel was draped over his eyes, steaming and fragrant with bay rum, plunging him into a warm darkness. The barber, a chatty man named Silas, had stepped into the back room for fresh water. In the corner of the shop, 2 cattlemen were waiting their turn, their voices low but carrying in the small space. "I give him 3 months, one man said. "Did you hear him breathing when he walked in? Sounds like a bellows full of gravel." "3 months is generous," the other replied. "Come spring thaw, there will be a funeral. Shame, really. He is a good doctor when he is sober enough to stand." "What about the house?" the first man asked. "That is a prime lot, right on the edge of the grazing land. Banker Davis is eyeing it. Says he can buy the deed for pennies on the dollar once the state takes it. Since Hale has no family, just that stray cat he took in." "The Mexican?" The man laughed. A rough, scratching sound. "She will be out the door fast enough. Davis will run her off the property with a shotgun if the sheriff does not do it first. She is just a housekeeper. She has no rights to a stick of furniture." Under the towel, Nate lay perfectly still. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a cold sweat break out that had nothing to do with the steam. He had been so focused on the daily battle for breath, on the immediate needs of his patients, that he had failed to look down the road. He had assumed, with the naive arrogance of a man who had always had a place in the world, that his protection would outlast his heartbeat. He had thought that simply by being under his roof, Lena was safe. He was wrong. He was going to die. And when he did, he would leave her to the wolves. Nate sat up, pulling the towel from his face. Silas returned with the water, but Nate waved him away. He tossed 2 coins on the counter, too much, but he did not care, and grabbed his coat. He walked out into the blinding winter light, his chest heaving, his mind sharpening into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. That evening, the wind was a living thing, tearing at the shingles and rattling the window panes in their frames. The house felt small and fragile against the vast darkness of the plains. Nate sat at the kitchen table. The oil lamp cast long, wavering shadows on the walls. He had been coughing for an hour, a brutal, tearing fit that left him gray-faced and trembling. The handkerchief in his hand was heavy with blood. Lena stood by the stove, stirring a pot of broth. Her back was to him, but he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. She was waiting for him to breathe again. "Lena," he said. His voice was a ruin, a rasp of gravel and air. She turned immediately, wiping her hands on her apron. "Do you need water? The laudanum?" "Sit down," he said. "Please." She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat. The lamplight caught the hollows of her throat and the dark intelligence of her eyes. She looked tired. He had done that to her. He had dragged her into his shadow. "I heard men talking today," Nate began, staring at his hands, which were resting on the scarred wood of the table. "They were betting on when I will die." Lena stiffened. "They are fools. Ignorant, cruel fools." "They are realistic," Nate corrected gently. "I am getting worse. Lena, we both know it. The winter is hard, and I do not think I will see another one." "Do not say that," she whispered. "You are strong. I am stubborn. There is a difference." He took a breath, fighting the tickle in his lungs. "But that is not what I need to say." They were talking about the house, about the practice, about you. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "When I die, the state will seize this property. I have no living relatives. No will can protect you fully if the town decides to contest it. They will say you were a servant. They will say you have no claim. They will put you on the street, Lena. Or worse." Lena looked down at the table. "I know. Mr. Wallace told me as much." Nate's jaw tightened. Wallace is a viper, but he is right about the law. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. It was not Elizabeth's ring. That was buried with her. This was a plain band he had bought from a traveling peddler years ago, intending to melt it down for gold leaf to repair a frame, but he never had. He placed it on the table between them. It caught the light, a small circle of permanence in a shifting world. "Marry me," he said. Lena stared at the ring. The room went silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the wind outside. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and stunned. "What?" "Marry me," Nate repeated, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "Not for love. I do not ask that of you. And not for duty. Marry me for the paper. If you are my wife, you are my heir. The house, the land, the instruments, the savings in the tin box, it all becomes yours. Automatic, irrevocable. They cannot throw a widow out of her husband's home. Not even this town." Lena sat frozen. The words swirled in her head, colliding with the memories of every man who had ever offered her something. They had offered her coins, drinks, false promises of safety, always with a leer, always with a price. But Nate was not leering. He looked terrified. "You want to marry me?" she said slowly, testing the weight of the words. "To save the house?" "To save you," Nate said. "You have become indispensable to me, Lena. Not just for the work, for the company, for the fact that you are the only person in this godforsaken territory who looks at me and sees a man, not a ghost. I cannot die knowing I left you with nothing." He leaned forward, his urgency making him cough again. A short, sharp bark. "I make no demands. You understand that? I will never force you. I will never ask for a wife's duties in that way. You can keep your room. It is a business arrangement. A shield." Lena looked at the ring again. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a rush of heat. To be a wife, to have a name that people had to respect, or at least acknowledge, to be Mrs. Hale. But then she looked at Nate. She saw the kindness that had never wavered, the respect he had shown her when she was covered in saloon dust. She saw the man who had stood between her and a fist. "Do you know what they will say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They already hate you for taking me in. If you marry me, they will say you have lost your mind. They will spit on your grave. Nate, they will say you dirtied your good name with a woman like me." "Let them talk," Nate said, and for the first time in months, he smiled. It was a faint, grim expression, but it was there. "My reputation can rot in the ground with me. I do not care about their respect. Lena, I care about your future. I care that you have a roof over your head and a lock on the door when I'm gone." He pushed the ring slightly closer to her. "Please, let me do this one thing right." Lena looked at his hand, thin, pale, trembling. She wanted to cover it with her own. She wanted to tell him that she didn't care about the house, that she would live in a sod hut if it meant he would stay with her. She wanted to tell him that she had already given him her heart, even if he hadn't asked for it. But she couldn't say those things. He was offering a contract, not a romance. He was trying to be noble. She stood up and walked to the window. The reflection of the room stared back at her. The warm light, the dying man, the woman who had nowhere else to go. "I need to think," she said. "Take the night," Nate said. "I will be here." She did not sleep. She paced the floor of the small back room, the boards creaking under her feet. She thought of the baby she had lost. She thought of the cold ditch. She thought of the years of being Lena from the saloon, a creature without a surname, without a history, without a future. And she thought of Nate. She thought of the way he looked at her when she tied a bandage correctly, with pride. She thought of the tea he made her. He was giving her his life, not the years he had left, but the weight of his existence, his name. By dawn, the wind had died down to a whisper. The sky was a bruised purple. Lena walked into the kitchen. Nate was asleep in his chair, his head lolling to the side, his breathing ragged. She touched his shoulder gently. He jerked awake, eyes wide with panic before they focused on her. "I will do it," she said. "If you are sure, if you trust me with your home, I will stay. Nate, I will stay until the end." Nate let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "I trust you," he said, "more than anyone." The wedding took place 3 days later. It was a Tuesday. There were no invitations sent. Nate simply walked to the church with Lena beside him and told Reverend Thomas they wished to be wed immediately. The Reverend, a sour-faced man who smelled of mothballs, looked from Nate's pale face to Lena's dark skin and pursed his lips. "This is highly irregular, doctor, and ill-advised." "It is legal," Nate rasped. "And it is my wish. Do you refuse to perform a sacrament?" "Reverend?" The Reverend sighed, sensing a battle he would not win. "Very well. I need witnesses." Sheriff Miller was dragged from his office, looking uncomfortable. The storekeeper's boy, a lad of 12 named Jimmy, was pulled in from the street to stand as the second witness. The church was freezing. The stove had not been lit. The light that streamed through the plain glass windows was hard and blue, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Lena wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had mended carefully. She had no flowers. She wore a shawl Nate had bought her, wrapped tight against the chill. Nate wore his Sunday suit, which hung loosely on his frame. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, trying to look like a bridegroom, but he looked like a man standing before a firing squad, stoic and resigned. "Do you, Nathaniel Hale, take this woman?" The words echoed in the empty space. No bells rang. No choir sang. Outside, a crow called, a harsh, grating sound. "I do," Nate said. His voice was stronger than it had been in days. "And do you, Maria Elena Morales?" Lena looked at Nate. She ignored the sheriff's shifting boots. She ignored the Reverend's judgmental stare. She looked only at the gray eyes that were watching her with a profound, quiet gratitude. "I do," she said. Nate took her hand. His skin was dry and cool. He slid the gold band onto her finger. It was slightly too big, but she curled her fingers to keep it safe. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend muttered, closing his Bible with a snap. "What God has joined, let no man put asunder." They walked out into the sunlight. The town was going about its business. A wagon rattled past. A woman sweeping her porch stopped and stared, her broom suspended in midair. Nate did not look at them. He tucked Lena's hand into the crook of his arm. "Let us go home, Mrs. Hale," he said. The walk back was silent, but the air between them had changed. It was charged, heavy with the realization of what they had done. They had drawn a line in the sand. When they entered the house, the warmth of the stove greeted them, but it did nothing to melt the sudden, awkward tension that filled the room. It was their house now. Theirs. Nate took off his coat, moving slowly. He hung it on the peg. He looked at the bedroom door, then at Lena. "Lena," he said, clearing his throat. "As I said, nothing needs to change. Your room is prepared. I will not." He trailed off, looking at the floor. "I am going to rest for a while." The walk was taxing. He turned toward his bedroom. "Nate." He stopped. Lena stood in the center of the parlor. She was twisting the gold ring on her finger. Her heart was beating so hard she thought he must be able to hear it across the room. "I am your wife," she said. "Yes," Nate said gently. "You are." "A wife does not sleep in the pantry," she said. Nate turned slowly. He looked at her, confusion warring with something else in his eyes. "Lena, you do not have to do this. I told you. It is a bargain. I do not expect payment." "I am not paying you," she said, her voice rising. "Do you think I am doing this for the roof, for the deed?" She took a step toward him. "I have been a servant my whole life. Nate, I have been a charity case. I have been the help. I will not be those things in this house. Not anymore. If I am your wife, I want to be your wife. In truth." Nate stared at her. "I am dying. Lena, look at me. I am a wreck. I cough blood. I shake. I cannot. He swallowed hard. I cannot be what a young woman needs. I do not need a young man, Lena said. She closed the distance between them. She reached out and took his hands, stilled their trembling. I need you. She saw the fear in him then. It wasn't fear of death. It was fear of being seen, really seen, in his weakness, in his decay. He was afraid that his touch would repulse her. He was afraid of hurting her with his own fragility. I am afraid, he whispered. So am I, she said. I am terrified. She led him into the bedroom. The room was simple, dominated by a large iron bed covered in a quilt. The late afternoon sun turned the walls a soft gold. She unbuttoned his shirt. Her fingers were steady, though her soul was shaking. She revealed his chest, the ribs counting themselves out against his pale skin, the scars of old struggles. He stood still, barely breathing, watching her face for a sign of disgust. He saw none. When she stepped out of her dress, clad only in her white shift, Nate let out a sound that was half sob, half prayer. He reached for her, his hands hesitant, reverent. They moved onto the bed. It was not the passionate, stormy collision of healthy bodies. It was slow. It was careful. It was a conversation spoken in touch. Nate kissed the palm of her hand, the hand that scrubbed floors, the hand that held reins, the hand that had buried a child. He pressed his lips to the calluses, worshipping the strength in them. Beautiful, he murmured against her skin. You are so beautiful. Lena traced the line of his spine, the sharp wing of his shoulder blade. She felt the heat of the fever under his skin, but it didn't frighten her. It felt like life burning fiercely before it went out. When they finally came together, the act was a reclamation. For Lena, it was taking back the right to be touched with love, not greed, to be held as if she were precious. For Nate, it was a defiance of the grave. It was proof that he was still a man, capable of connection, capable of giving pleasure even as his body failed him. He had to pause, gasping for breath, his forehead resting against hers. She didn't pull away. She held him, her legs wrapped around him, anchoring him to the earth. I am here, she whispered into his hair. I am here, she cried, quiet tears that soaked into the pillow. They were tears for the baby she lost, for the years she wasted, and for the man she was holding who would leave her too soon. But they were also tears of relief. The loneliness that had eaten at her for so long was gone, displaced by the weight of him. They lay together afterwards as the sun went down and the room turned blue and cold. Nate pulled the quilt up over them, tucking it around her shoulders. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin, soap and sage and woman. Thank you, he said into the dark. Sleep, husband, she said softly. He slept. For the first time in months. He slept without the laudanum, held in the circle of her arms. In the weeks that followed, the house found a new rhythm. The town still gossiped. The stairs were still sharp. But they landed differently now. Lena wore the gold ring like armor. When she walked into the store, she signed for the goods as Mrs. Hale, her handwriting looping and bold in the ledger. Wallace would scowl, but he would let her take the flour. Inside the house, the silence was replaced by the sounds of a life shared. The clatter of 2 plates at dinner, the low murmur of voices reading aloud in the evening. Lena took charge. She managed the household accounts, stretching the dollars further than Nate ever could. She organized the clinic, labeling jars, sweeping out the dust. She became the gatekeeper, deciding which late-night knocks were emergencies and which could wait until morning, fiercely protecting Nate's rest. And Nate allowed himself to be cared for. It was a surrender he had fought for years, but now he accepted it as a gift. He allowed himself small luxuries he had denied himself since Elizabeth died. In the evenings, while the wind howled outside like a frustrated beast, he would lie on the rug by the stove, his head in Lena's lap. She would read from one of his medical books or a novel, her fingers absent-mindedly combing through his hair, massaging his scalp. He would close his eyes and listen to her voice, the Spanish accent softening the sharp English vowels. He would feel the warmth of her thigh against his cheek. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would wake up coughing, the familiar panic seizing his chest. But now, he wasn't alone. Lena would be there instantly, rubbing his back, holding a cup of water to his lips, whispering him through the terror until the air returned. And afterwards, when the fit passed, she would curl against him, her back to his chest, and he would wrap his arm around her waist, his hand resting on her stomach. Desire did not fix his lungs. It did not stop the blood from coming, but it stitched the two of them together so tightly that the seams disappeared. They were no longer two people facing the dark. They were one creature, breathing with two sets of lungs, facing the end of the world with a defiance that looked very much like joy. One morning, Nate watched Lena standing at the window, the sunlight turning her profile to gold. She was looking out at the mountains, a small smile on her lips. He felt a sudden, piercing pang of regret. Not that he was dying, but that he had waited so long to live. But then she turned, caught his eye, and the smile widened into something just for him. "Coffee is ready," she said. "I am coming," he answered. And for that moment, in the small house at the edge of the high plains, it was enough. Spring arrived in Granite Springs not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent thaw. The snow that had entombed the town for months turned to gray slush, and the frozen earth heaved and cracked, turning the main street into a river of sucking mud. The creeks, long silent under ice, roared back to life, brown and swollen, tearing at their banks. It was a season of raw energy, of wildflowers pushing their desperate heads through the mat of dead grass, and of the wind shifting from a knife edge to a heavy, wet blanket. For Lena, the change in season brought a heaviness she could not shake. At first, she blamed the extra work. With the thaw came the accidents, wagons slipping in the mire, horses spooking at the thunder of the cracking river, men breaking bones as they tried to force the waking land into submission. The clinic was busy from dawn until dusk, and Lena was on her feet constantly, washing linens, grinding powders, and holding lanterns steady while Nate stitched torn flesh. But this exhaustion felt different. It was a bone-deep weariness that sleep did not cure. In the mornings, the smell of the coffee she brewed, a scent she had always loved for its promise of warmth, suddenly turned her stomach. She found herself gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, fighting down waves of nausea that roiled like the muddy creek outside. She told no one. She swallowed her sickness with dry bread and kept moving. She was the doctor's wife now, and she had a reputation to uphold. She would not be the weak link in the chain Nate relied on. It happened on a Tuesday evening. They had ridden out to the edge of the mining camp to see a foreman with a crushed foot. The air in the foreman's cabin was thick with the smell of unwashed men and pipe tobacco. As Lena unwrapped the bandages to apply a fresh poultice, the room suddenly tilted. The walls seemed to stretch away from her, and the floor rushed up to meet her knees. She did not fall, but she stumbled, catching herself against the rough timber of the bed frame. "Mrs. Hale?" the foreman asked, his voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. Nate was there instantly. He dropped the bottle of carbolic acid he was holding and grabbed her arm. His touch was firm, professional, but she could feel the tremor of fear beneath it. "Sit," he commanded, guiding her to a stool. "Put your head between your knees." The dizziness passed, leaving a cold sweat on her skin. She looked up to find Nate staring at her, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that stripped her bare. He said nothing in front of the foreman, but his silence was loud. When they returned to the clinic, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the mud. Nate helped her down from her mule, his hands lingering on her waist. "Inside," he said. "Now." He led her not to the kitchen, but to the examination cot in the surgery. He lit the lamp, turning the wick high. "Nate, I am fine," Lena protested, though her voice was thin. It was just the heat in the cabin, the smell. "Lie down," Nate said. His voice was not the voice of a husband. It was the voice of the physician. He checked her pulse, his fingers cool against her wrist. He checked the color of her eyelids. He pressed his hands gently against her abdomen. Then he stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at her. "How long has it been, Lena?" he asked. "How long since what?" "Since your monthly course." The room went silent. The only sound was the dripping of water from the eaves outside. Lena lay frozen on the cot. She counted back in her mind. 1 month, 2. She had been so busy, so consumed by the daily struggle to keep Nate alive and the house running, that she had simply stopped tracking the rhythm of her own body. She sat up slowly, her hand going to her stomach. 2 months, she whispered. "Perhaps 3. Nate leaned against his desk as if his legs had suddenly given out. His face, already pale from his illness, went the color of old parchment. He looked at her, and then he looked at the medical books on the shelf, as if searching for an alternative explanation. "You are with child," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Shock rolled through them both. For Nate, it was a physical blow. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was not in the clinic but in a room 6 years ago, smelling blood and hearing the terrible silence of a baby that would not cry. He saw the knitted booties in the drawer. He heard the whispers of the town spinsters, the certainty that he was a man who dealt in death, not life. He had accepted his barrenness as a penance. The idea that his broken, failing body had created life felt like a violation of a natural law. "It cannot be," he murmured, opening his eyes. I am sick. Lena, I am dying. How can life come from this?" He gestured vaguely at his own chest. Lena stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. But they were not tears of grief. A bubble of laughter rose in her throat, hysterical and bright. She pressed her hands over her flat belly. "It is," she said. "I know it is." She remembered the ditch. She remembered the cold stones. She remembered the hollow ache that had lived inside her for 2 years. And now, against all odds, against all reason, there was a second chance growing in the warmth of this house. "A baby," she whispered. She slid off the cot and went to him. Nate looked terrified. He looked at her abdomen as if it were a ticking bomb. "Lena," he said, his voice cracking. "My lungs, the sickness. What if the child is... What if it is like me? What if I cannot..." He stopped, unable to voice the deepest fear, that he would bring a child into the world only to leave it fatherless before it could walk. "Then we will love it twice as much for the time we have," Lena said fiercely. She took his face in her hands. "Nate, look at me. We made this. You and I." He looked at her, and slowly, the terror in his eyes gave way to a dawning, fragile wonder. He placed his hand over hers on her stomach. His fingers trembled. "A baby," he repeated, testing the word. But the world outside the clinic walls was not so kind. In Granite Springs, secrets were harder to keep than water in a sieve. It started with Mrs. Gable seeing Lena stop on the boardwalk to retch into a rain barrel. It was confirmed when the smithy's wife noticed Nate buying lengths of soft flannel and asking questions about the price of a new cradle at the mercantile. The gossip exploded like a powder keg. "Pregnant, Mr. Wallace sneered, holding court by the pickle barrel in his store. "That is rich. Everyone knows the doctor is a gelding. His first wife died trying to birth a stillborn. And he has been half ghost ever since. He hasn't got the sap to sire a weed, let alone a child." "Then whose is it?" a young miner asked, leaning on a shovel. Wallace laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Use your head, boy. She is a saloon girl. She spent years on her back before she moved into that house. Probably some drifter passing through. Or maybe she has been sneaking out to the mining camp while the doctor is coughing his lungs out. It is a bastard, plain and simple. And Heir is a fool if he thinks he can pass it off as his own." The poison spread. When Lena walked to the market, the silence was no longer just judgmental. It was mocking. Men smirked at her midsection. Women whispered behind their fans, their eyes darting to her waist. "Did you hear?" she heard a woman say as she passed the millinery. Cuckoo in the nest. Lena kept her head high, but the shame burned her cheeks. It was one thing to be called dirty. It was another to be called a liar. Nate heard it too. He heard the silence fall when he entered the barber shop. He saw the way men looked at him, with pity, as if he were a cuckold too stupid to know he had been played. The worst of it came from Wallace. The shopkeeper had been nursing a grudge ever since Nate had treated the widow Clark's children for free, undercutting the patent medicines Wallace sold. Wallace had his eye on Nate's land, a prime plot that backed up to the creek. "Mark my words," Wallace told the gathered crowd one Saturday. "When the doctor kicks the bucket, that woman and her half-breed bastard will be out on their ears. The law does not recognize the claims of a whore's brat. I have written to Mrs. Hale's cousin in St. Louis, the real Mrs. Hale. There are blood rights to consider." Nate came home that evening shaking with rage and exhaustion. He slammed the door, a rare display of temper that made the china rattle. "They say it is not mine," he choked out, collapsing into his chair. "They say I am incapable." Lena was stirring a pot of stew. She froze. She turned to him, seeing the devastation on his face. It wasn't just the insult to her fidelity. It was the insult to his manhood, the final cruel twist of the knife that had been stuck in him since Elizabeth died. "They do not know us," Lena said quietly. "They know I am dying," Nate shouted, then bent double, coughing until he wheezed. When he straightened, his eyes were wet. "They look at me and see a corpse. They cannot believe a corpse could make a life. Lena, maybe they are right to doubt. Look at me. What kind of father is this?" He gestured to his thin frame, the handkerchief in his hand. Lena abandoned the stove. She crossed the room and knelt before him. "Nate, stop it," she said. "You are not a corpse. You are my husband. And I know who I lie with at night." "Do you?" Nate whispered. "Or do you lie with a burden?" "I chose you," she said, her voice fierce and low. "Do you understand that? I could have left. I could have taken the money and run. I stayed. I climbed into your bed because I wanted to. I chose a dying man because he was the only man who ever treated me like I was precious. I would rather have 1 year with you, Nate Hale, and a baby with your eyes, than 50 years of safety with a man like Wallace." Nate looked at her, stunned by the ferocity of her love. He reached out and touched her cheek. "My eyes," he said weakly. "Poor child. Better he has your spirit." That night, their intimacy took on a desperate, holy quality. The wind was dry and hot, a precursor to the summer, blowing dust against the window panes. In the bedroom, Nate undressed Lena slowly. His hands, usually so clinical, were trembling with reverence. He knelt on the floor before her, pressing his face against the slight swell of her belly. "I am sorry," he whispered into her skin. "I am sorry for the talk. I am sorry I will not be there to teach him to ride. I am sorry I am leaving you with this fight." "Hush," Lena said, weaving her fingers through his thinning hair. "You are here now." He kissed her stomach, then her hips, then her thighs. He made love to her with a slow, agonizing tenderness, as if he were trying to memorize the map of her body with his own. He was careful of her changing shape, careful of his own weight, but the fire between them burned hotter than it ever had. It was a reclaiming. With every touch, he was shouting silently against the town, against the rumors, against death itself. "This is mine. This is real." When the climax came, Lena cried out, clinging to his shoulders, terrified by the depth of her own feeling. "They will try to take him," she sobbed, the fear finally breaking through. "Wallace, he says they will take everything." Nate held her tight, his chest heaving against hers. He tasted the salt of her tears. "Over my dead body," he rasped. "And even then, I will fight them." The next morning, Nate rose with a cold determination that seemed to lend him a borrowed strength. He put on his best suit, brushed the dust from his hat, and ordered Lena to dress. "Where are we going?" she asked, eyeing his grim face. "To the law," Nate said. They rode into town, Nate on Bess and Lena on the mule. They rode straight to the sheriff's office, where a traveling circuit judge was holding court for the week. Sheriff Miller looked up, surprised, as Nate marched in, Lena trailing a step behind. "Doctor, is there trouble?" "I need a document drawn up. Judge," Nate said to the man behind the desk. Ignoring Miller, "A will, and an affidavit of paternity." The judge, a weary man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked over his glasses. "Paternity? My wife is with child," Nate said, his voice ringing clear in the small office. "There is talk in this town, malicious talk. I want it set down in ink, witnessed and sealed, that I acknowledge this child as my own, born of my lawful marriage. I want it stated that my wife, Maria Elena Hale, is the sole heir to my property, my practice, and every cent I possess, and that, upon my death, the guardianship of my child remains with her and her alone." The judge dipped his pen. "A wise precaution, given the circumstances." "Write it," Nate said. "Write it so tight that God himself could not pick the lock." For an hour, the scratch of the pen was the only sound. Nate dictated terms, listing every acre, every instrument, every book. He named the child, heir to my body and my name. When it was done, Nate signed with a hand that shook but did not falter. He handed the pen to Miller to witness. "There," Nate said, blowing on the ink. "Let Wallace try to argue with the state of Wyoming." He paid the judge, took the copy of the document, and folded it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. When they walked out onto the street, he took Lena's arm openly. He glared at the men sitting on the cracker barrels in front of the store until they looked away. Wallace heard about it within the hour. He stood in the doorway of his shop, his face purple with impotent rage. Watching the couple ride back toward the edge of town, he spat into the dust. "Paper," he muttered. "Just paper. We will see what the cousin says." But the document changed something. It was a shield, however thin, and it allowed Lena to breathe again. Summer hit the high plains like a hammer. The green of spring vanished, scorched into a brittle brown. The creeks receded, leaving cracked mud banks. The wind became a dragon's breath, hot and dry, carrying the scent of sage and dust. For Nate, the heat was a torture. The dry air irritated his lungs, turning his cough into a constant, hacking bark that left him gasping for air. The rides to distant ranches became impossible. After one particularly brutal trip to set a broken arm, he had fallen from his horse in the yard, unable to stand. Lena made the decision. "You do not ride anymore," she said, helping him into the cool of the parlor. "The patience," he wheezed. "I will go," she said. So began the strange sight of the pregnant doctor's wife riding out alone with the medical bag strapped to her saddle. At first, the ranchers were hostile. "I ain't letting no woman touch me," a cowhand with a festering arrow wound growled when Lena arrived at the bunkhouse. "Where's the doc?" "The doctor is unwell," Lena said, her voice sharp. "You can let me clean that, or you can lose the arm. Your choice." Pain is a great pragmatist. The cowhand let her work. He watched, teeth gritted, as she cleaned the wound with the same efficiency Nate had taught her. She stitched the skin, her hands steady despite the swell of her belly pressing against her apron. "That didn't hurt so much," he grunted when she was done. "Keep it clean," she ordered, wiping her hands. "I will be back in 3 days to check it." Slowly, grudgingly, the tide began to turn. They saw her riding through the heat, sweating and heavy with child, doing the work of a man. They saw that she knew her herbs. They saw that she didn't flinch at blood or pus. They still complained. They still called her the Mexican woman when she wasn't listening. But they opened their doors. One afternoon in August, a wagon rattled up to the doctor's house. It was driven by Elias Thorne, an old rancher with skin like tanned leather and a reputation for being meaner than a rattlesnake. Nate had saved Elias's life 2 winters ago during a pneumonia outbreak. Lena was on the porch, shelling peas, trying to catch a non-existent breeze. Nate was inside, resting. Elias climbed down stiffly. He walked to the back of his wagon and untied a horse that was tethered there. It was a mare, a sturdy bay with intelligent eyes and a glossy coat, clearly well-fed and gentle. He walked the horse up to the porch railing and tied it. "Mr. Thorne?" Lena asked, standing up. "Is your chest troubling you?" Elias took off his hat, twisting it in his hands. He looked at Lena's stomach, then at her face. He didn't smile, but his eyes weren't hard. "Heard your mule went lame last week," Elias said gruffly. "He is resting," Lena said. "He's old. Can't have you riding a lame mule," Elias said. He gestured to the mare. "Her name is Lady. She is smooth-gaited. Won't jostle you." Lena stared at the horse. A mare like that was worth $50. Maybe more. "Mr. Thorne, we cannot pay for a horse like this." "Oh, didn't ask for payment," Elias snapped. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "The doc saved me. Reckon he is too sick to collect on the favor. And any woman who sticks by a man like him, carrying his load while carrying his child, well, she deserves better than a mule." He climbed back onto his wagon before Lena could speak. "You take care of her, missus," he called out. "And tell the doc. Tell him Elias says hello." Lena stood on the porch, her hand resting on the mare's warm neck. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. It wasn't just a horse. It was an acknowledgement. It was the first crack in the wall of the town's prejudice. Nate came to the screen door, drawn by the sound of the wagon. He looked at the mare, then at Lena's tear-streaked face. "Elias?" he asked softly. "Yes," Lena said. "He brought her for me." Nate leaned his forehead against the screen mesh. A look of profound peace crossed his face, smoothing out the lines of pain for a moment. "You see, Lena," he whispered. "They are learning, slowly, but they are learning." She turned to him, the sun catching the gold band on her finger. "We are teaching them," she said. But as the heat of the day pressed down, Lena felt a sudden, sharp kick from within. The baby. Life asserting itself. She smiled, but the smile faltered as she heard Nate's breath hitch and catch, turning into another coughing fit that rattled the very frame of the house. The mare whinnied softly, a sound of life in a place that smelled of dry grass and fading time. Summer was ending. The baby was coming, and Nate was fading with the light. The transition from autumn to winter on the high plains was not a gradual decline, but a brutal execution. The golden light that had briefly graced the sagebrush in October vanished, replaced by a sky the color of wet slate that seemed to lower itself day by day until it scraped the chimney tops. The grass turned brittle and gray, snapping underfoot like small bones, and the creeks froze into jagged scars of ice that wound through the valley. For Nate, the cold was an enemy that had breached the gates. The dry, biting air of summer had irritated his lungs, but the damp, freezing weight of winter sought to crush them. His cough, once a rhythmic barking that marked the hours of the day, became a constant, tearing presence. Nights were the hardest. The temperature in the bedroom would drop despite the banked fire, and the cold air would settle in the bottom of his chest like lead. He would wake gasping, sitting bolt upright in the dark, fighting for oxygen that seemed too thin to sustain him. "I am here," Lena would whisper, waking instantly. She would be there before he could even reach for the water, her hands warm on his back, rubbing circles between his shoulder blades as he heaved and retched. She would hold him upright, her own body heavy with the child, offering her strength as a scaffold for his failing frame. Outside, the snow would rattle against the glass like handfuls of gravel thrown by a ghost. But inside, the only sound was the terrifying struggle of a man trying to draw breath. Lena was entering her 9th month. Her belly was high and hard, a majestic curve beneath her woolen dress. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, one hand often resting on her lower back to ease the ache that settled there. Her ankles were swollen, and the simple act of lacing her boots had become a comedy of angles that usually ended with Nate kneeling to do it for her, his breath wheezing as he tied the knots. Despite his protests, she refused to stop working. "I am pregnant. Nate, not invalid," she would say, grinding herbs in the mortar while he sat in the chair, too exhausted to argue. The women of my mother's people walked until the water broke and then walked again with the baby in the sling. I can surely wipe a counter. But she was watchful. She had inherited her father's scout eyes and her mother's intuition. She watched the sky with a wariness that bordered on superstition. She smelled the air when she went out to the woodpile, tasting the metallic tang that heralded a shift in the weather. "It is coming," she said one evening in late December. Nate looked up from his ledger. He looked gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, his eyes bright with the fever that rose every afternoon. "What is coming?" "The big snow," Lena said. She pointed to the mountains, which were vanished behind a veil of white mist. "The wind has changed. It smells like iron." Nate felt a spike of anxiety. He had been planning, calculating the days with a desperate precision. He had intended to send for Mrs. Harrow, the midwife in Laramie, 2 weeks before the due date. He had stocked the pantry with flour and dried beans. He had ordered extra coal. "I will send a telegram to Laramie tomorrow," Nate said, standing up too quickly and swaying. "We will get Mrs. Harrow here early, and I will speak to the sheriff about having the deputy check on us daily." "Sit down, husband," Lena said gently. "You cannot control the weather." "I must control what I can," Nate snapped, his voice tight with fear. "I will not have you alone. Not with me like this." He was terrified. The memory of Elizabeth's silence in this very house, the blood on the sheets, the tiny, lifeless weight of his son. It was a nightmare that lived in the corners of the room. He knew his own limitations. He knew that if complications arose, he might not have the strength to pull a child free or stem a hemorrhage. He needed hands that did not shake. But the high plains did not care for the plans of men. The blizzard struck 2 days later, not with a whimper, but with a roar that shook the foundations of the earth. It began at noon with a deceptive flurry of large, soft flakes. By 2 o'clock, the wind had risen to a shriek, driving the snow horizontally at 40 miles an hour. By 4 o'clock, the world outside the window had ceased to exist. There was only white, a blinding, churning white darkness that swallowed the barn, the fence, and the town beyond. The temperature plummeted. The drafty house turned into an icebox. Nate and Lena moved the mattress from the bedroom into the main room. Pushing it close to the cast-iron stove, they hung quilts over the windows to stop the drafts, transforming the clinic parlor into a dim, fabric-lined cave. "It will pass by morning," Nate said, feeding coal into the stove with a trembling hand. "These storms burn themselves out quickly." He was wrong. The storm raged through the night and into the next day. A relentless assault. The snow piled up against the door, drifting halfway up the windows. The wind howled down the chimney, sending puffs of smoke back into the room. And in the heart of the storm, Lena felt the first cramp. It was a dull ache, wrapping around her lower back like a heavy belt. She paused in her mending, closing her eyes until it passed. She said nothing. Nate was sitting in the armchair, his breathing loud and wet, his face gray in the lamplight. He had coughed up blood twice that morning, bright, fresh arterial blood that terrified her more than the storm. She could not add to his burden. She breathed through the next one, and the one after that. But by evening, the pains were no longer dull. They were sharp, gripping vices that stole her breath. She stood up to put the kettle on the stove and doubled over, gripping the back of the chair, a low groan escaping her lips before she could catch it. Nate's head snapped up. He dropped his book. "Lena," she tried to smile, but another contraction seized her, twisting her face into a grimace. "It seems," she gasped, "that our son is as impatient as his father." Nate was across the room in an instant, his fatigue forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. He gripped her arms, his eyes wide. "Now? It is starting now." "Yes," she whispered. Nate looked at the window. The quilt moved slightly with the force of the wind outside. The roar was deafening. No one could travel in this. A man would freeze to death or lose his way 10 feet from the door. There would be no Mrs. Harrow, no sheriff, no help. It was just them. A cold jolt went through Nate. sharper than the ice on the glass. He was the only doctor for miles. And he was dying. He looked at his hands. They were trembling with a fine, palsy-like tremor. "Nate," Lena said, her voice cutting through his panic. She reached out and took his face in her hands. "Look at me. I do not need Mrs. Harrow. I need you." "I cannot," Nate stammered. "Lena, if something goes wrong, I do not have the strength to—" "You have the knowledge," she said fiercely. "And you have the love. That is enough. We are doing this. Nathaniel, right here, you and me." She led him, not the other way around, to the mattress by the stove. The house became a capsule, floating in a void of wind and snow. Time lost its meaning. There was only the rhythm of pain and the hiss of the fire. Nate moved into a trance of professional necessity. He set up his station on a low table. Clean towels, a basin of hot water, scissors, twine, a bottle of alcohol. He forced himself to swallow a dose of laudanum, not enough to cloud his mind, but enough to dull the tearing pain in his chest so he could function. He checked Lena. She was dilating, but slowly. It would be a long night. "Breathe," he instructed her, his voice low and steady, hiding the fear that clawed at his throat. "Slow breaths. Lena, save your strength." Hours bled into one another. The wind screamed like a banshee, shaking the loose boards of the roof. Every time a particularly violent gust hit, Nate glanced upward, praying the wood would hold. Lena fought. She was a warrior in the bed, gripping the iron rails until her knuckles turned white. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead. Despite the chill in the room, she did not scream. She moaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in Nate's own bones. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He held her hand when the waves hit. He murmured to her in a mix of medical instruction and lover's comfort. "You are doing beautifully," he whispered. "The baby is turned correctly. I can feel the head." But the labor dragged on. Midnight came and went. Lena's strength was waning. Her face was pale, her eyes dark pits of exhaustion. "I cannot," she gasped after a particularly brutal contraction that seemed to last forever. "Nate, I cannot do it anymore." "You can," Nate said, his voice raspy. "You must. You are the strongest woman I have ever known. Think of the trail. Lena, think of the dust storm. You survived that. You will survive this." He was terrified. Her pulse was thready. If she exhausted herself before the final stage, he would have to use the forceps. And his hands. He looked at his hands. They were shaking so badly he had to clasp them together to stop it. Suddenly, a spasm of irritation hit Nate's lungs. He tried to suppress it, turning his head away, but it was too strong. He doubled over, coughing. It was a violent, hacking fit that tore at the lining of his chest. He fell to his knees beside the mattress, clutching the bedpost. The sound was terrible, wet and tearing, drowning out the wind. "Nate!" Lena cried out, reaching for him, her own pain forgotten. Nate couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in his vision. He felt the warm, metallic rush of blood filling his mouth. He gagged, spitting into the basin he had prepared for the birth. The water turned a shocking, bright red. He slumped against the floor, his head spinning. Darkness encroached on the edges of his vision. It would be so easy to let go, to just lie down on the floor and let the cold take him. The pain in his chest was unbearable, a fire that consumed everything. "Nate!" Lena screamed. It wasn't a scream of labor. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. "Do not you dare! Do not you dare leave me!" Her voice pierced the fog. He looked up. He saw her face hanging over the edge of the mattress, twisted in fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't afraid of the birth. She was afraid of the silence he would leave behind. He could not die. Not yet. Not while she was alone in the storm. With a groan that sounded torn from the earth itself, Nate clawed his way back. He gripped the bedpost, his knuckles white. He forced air into his ruined lungs. He wiped the blood from his mouth with his sleeve, smearing it across his cheek like war paint. "I am here," he wheezed. He pulled himself up. He was swaying, gray as ash, blood on his lips, but his eyes were clear. "I am here, Lena," he said, his voice a broken rasp. "I am not going anywhere until this child cries." "Damn you," she sobbed, grabbing his hand and crushing it. "Damn you, do not you stop breathing. Push," Nate said. "The next one comes. You push." Outside, the town of Granite Springs was hunkered down, blind and deaf. Sheriff Miller sat in his office, feet up on the stove, watching the snow pile up against the window. He had tried to walk to the doctor's house an hour ago, but the drifts were waist high and the wind had nearly blown him into the horse trough. "Hope they are all right over there," the deputy muttered, dealing a hand of solitaire. "Nate is smart," Miller said, though his stomach churned with unease. "He will keep the fire up." 3 streets away, in the apartment above the dry goods store, Mr. Wallace poured himself a brandy. He looked out at the white void where the doctor's house stood at the edge of town. "Timber is old," Wallace muttered to his wife, who was knitting by the fire. "Timbers are rotted. A heavy snow like this could crush it flat." "Hush, Harold," his wife scolded. "That is a Christian soul you are wishing ill on." "He is a fool who married a whore," Wallace snapped. "If nature takes its course tonight, the town is better for it. The property reverts to the state, and we can finally buy that creek frontage." At the widow Clark's house, a candle burned in the window. She was on her knees, praying. She remembered how Nate had sat up all night with her youngest when the croup took him, how Lena had ridden out in the heat to bring burn salve. "Watch over them," she whispered into the dark. "Please, God, let the house stand." Back in the clinic, the battle had reached its fever pitch. The world had narrowed to the circle of lamplight. The wind was forgotten. The cold was forgotten. There was only the primal struggle of life trying to break free. "He is crowning," Nate said, his voice barely audible. "I can see dark hair, Lena, just like yours." Lena threw her head back, a guttural cry tearing from her throat. She was beyond exhaustion, operating on pure instinct. "Again," Nate commanded. "With everything you have." "I hate you," she screamed at him, gripping his forearm so hard her nails drew blood. "I hate you for making me love you." "I know," Nate wept, tears mingling with the sweat on his face. "I know. Push, Lena, push for him." She pushed. She poured every ounce of her spirit, every year of her grief, every hope for the future into one final, earth-shattering effort. Nate's hands were there. They were not shaking now. They were guided by a force greater than muscle or nerve. He supported the head. He guided the shoulders. And then, with a rush of fluid and warmth, the child slipped into his hands. Silence. For one terrifying second, there was only the sound of the wind. Nate felt his heart stop. He looked down at the small, slippery form in his hands. Then, the baby drew a breath. A small chest expanded, and a cry, loud, angry, and undeniably alive, shattered the room. Nate let out a sob that shook his entire body. "He is alive," he choked out. "Lena, he is alive." He lifted the baby. It was a boy. He was red-faced, furious, and wriggling with a strength that belied the storm raging outside. "Look at him," Nate wept, turning the baby so Lena could see. "He is perfect. He is strong. He is everything they said he could not be." He placed the wailing bundle onto Lena's chest. Lena's arms closed around the child. She touched the wet, dark hair. She counted the fingers. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart against hers. The pain of the labor vanished, replaced by a joy so intense it felt like burning. "My son," she whispered. "My little survivor." Nate stood over them, one hand on the baby's back, the other gripping the bed frame. He looked at the tableau, the dark-skinned woman, the screaming infant, the firelight dancing on the walls. It was the holiest thing he had ever seen. "You gave him to me," Nate whispered. "You gave me an heir." Then the string snapped. The adrenaline that had held Nate upright evaporated. The room went gray. The sound of the baby's cry seemed to recede down a long tunnel. He tried to sit on the edge of the bed, but his legs dissolved. He collapsed into the chair beside the mattress, his head lolling back. "Nate!" Lena's voice was sharp, cutting through her haze of joy. Nate didn't answer. His eyes were half open, rolled back slightly. His skin was the color of wet ash. His breathing was shallow, a terrifyingly faint flutter in his chest. Lena froze. The terror of the night came rushing back, colder than the blizzard. She had won the battle for the child, but the war for her husband was being lost in front of her eyes. "No!" she hissed. She shifted the baby, tucking him into the crook of her arm against her breast. With her free hand, she reached out and grabbed Nate's shoulder, shaking him hard. "Nathaniel Hale!" she shouted. "Wake up!" Nate's head lolled. A line of drool mixed with blood escaped the corner of his mouth. He was sliding away. The effort had cost him everything. "Do not you leave me with this baby," Lena commanded, her voice fierce and trembling. "Do not you dare make me a widow tonight. Open your eyes." She grabbed the blanket from the foot of the bed and threw it over him. She reached for the cup of water, splashing it onto his face. Nate gasped, a wet, rattling intake of air. His eyes fluttered and focused, dimly, on her face. "Tired," he whispered. "So tired. Lena." "I know," she said, leaning close to him, their foreheads touching. The baby squirmed between them, his cries quieting to a whimper. "But you cannot sleep. Not like that. You have to stay. Look at him. Nate, look at your son." She took Nate's limp hand and pressed it to the baby's back. "Feel that?" she demanded. "That is your blood. That is your life. You have to stay to see it." Nate blinked. He focused on the small, warm weight under his hand. He felt the rise and fall of the new life. It was a tether, a rope thrown to a drowning man. He took a breath, then another. It was agony, but he took it. "I am staying," he breathed. Lena watched him, her eyes fierce as a wolf's. She kept her hand over his, pressing it to the child, binding the three of them together in a circuit of heat and will. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white. But inside the small, creaking house, death had come to the door, looked inside, and, for tonight, had turned away. The dawn that broke over Granite Springs after the blizzard was not like any morning the town had ever seen. The light was strange and muffled, filtered through a sky that remained a bruised, opalescent gray. The wind, which had screamed like a banshee for 48 hours, had vanished completely, leaving behind a silence so deep and heavy it seemed to hum in the ears. The town was buried. Drifts of snow, sculpted into razor-edged waves by the gale, reached the windowsills of the false front buildings on Main Street. The world had been erased and redrawn in blinding white. Sheriff Miller was the first man to break the stillness. He emerged from his office with a shovel, his breath puffing white in the frigid air. He was joined by 2 deputies and the blacksmith, a giant of a man named Lars. They did not speak. They simply began to dig a path toward the edge of town, toward the small house that sat isolated against the open prairie. Every eye that peered from a cracked door or a frosted window watched them. They were looking for the smoke. "There," Lars grunted, pointing a gloved finger. A thin, gray ribbon of smoke was curling lazily from the chimney of the doctor's house, rising straight up into the still air. It was a flag of survival. "They kept the fire," Miller said, relief making his voice rough. "Come on, put your backs into it." It took them an hour to reach the porch. The snow was waist-deep, packing hard against their legs. Miller reached the door first. It was blocked by a drift, and he had to shovel it clear before he could turn the handle. It was unlocked. Miller pushed the door open, bracing himself for what he might find: freezing cold, sickness, or worse. The wave of heat that hit him smelled of wood smoke, copper, and exhaustion. The room was dim, lit only by the glowing grate of the stove. The furniture had been pushed to the walls. In the center of the room, on a mattress dragged near the fire, lay the doctor and his wife. Nate was propped up on pillows, his face the color of old paper, his eyes closed. His chest rose and fell with a shallow, rattling rhythm, but it moved. Lena sat beside him, her back against the legs of an overturned chair. She was pale, her hair loose and tangled, dark circles bruised beneath her eyes, but in her arms, wrapped in a bundle of flannel, was a small, living shape. Lena raised her head as the men entered. Her eyes were fierce, the eyes of a wolf cornered in its den. Her hand moved instinctively to cover the bundle. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," Miller said softly. Taking off his hat, Lena let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging. "Sheriff, we were worried about the roof," Miller stammered, feeling suddenly intrusive in this sanctuary of survival. "And the fire." "The roof held," Lena said, her voice hoarse. She looked down at the bundle, and the fire did not go out. Nate stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, glassy and unfocused at first. He turned his head slowly, wincing, until he saw the sheriff. A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "Miller," Nate rasped. "You are late." Miller laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "I reckon I am. Doc, I reckon I am." He stepped closer, peering at the bundle in Lena's arms. "Is that—" "His name is William," Nate whispered, pride lending a momentary strength to his voice. "William Hale." Miller looked at the baby, then at Lena, and finally at the wreckage of the room. The bloody basins, the towels, the sheer evidence of the battle that had been fought in the dark. He looked at Lena with a new expression. It was not the look one gave a saloon girl. It was the look one gave a soldier who had held the line against impossible odds. "Well," Miller said, tipping his hat to her, "I have known cowhands who would have frozen to death or quit halfway through a night like that. You are made of tough stuff, ma'am, tougher than half the men in this territory." Lena looked down at her son, sleeping soundly despite the intrusion. "We had a reason to fight," she said. The news traveled faster than the thaw. By noon, the entire town knew that the doctor and the Mexican woman had survived the storm, and that there was a child. Curiosity overwhelmed prejudice. Women who had crossed the street to avoid Lena now found excuses to trudge through the snow to the doctor's door. They brought loaves of bread, jars of preserved peaches, and bundles of firewood. They claimed it was charity for the invalid doctor, but their eyes went instantly to the cradle Nate had moved into the parlor. "Let me see him, Mrs. Gable said one afternoon, peering into the blankets. She was ready to sneer, ready to see a child with dark skin that proved the baby was a bastard. She stopped. The baby blinking up at her had Lena's dark hair. Yes, but his eyes were a startling, clear gray. And when he fussed, the set of his jaw was a mirror image of the man coughing in the armchair across the room. He has the doctor's chin," Mrs. Gable murmured. "Surprised. He has his father's temper, too," Lena said from the kitchen, where she was boiling water. She did not ask for their approval. She merely stated the fact. People began to notice other things. They saw the way the baby quieted instantly when Nate spoke to him, his rasping voice acting like a lullaby. They saw the way Nate looked at Lena, not with the shame of a man trapped, but with a naked, terrifying devotion. It was hard to maintain the rumor that the baby was a bastard when the child was the living map of his father's face. Doubt began to creep into the certainty of the town's judgment. Mr. Wallace, however, was not a man to let go of a grudge. The shopkeeper saw his opportunity slipping away. If the child was accepted, if the marriage stood, the Creekside property would never be his. He began a campaign of whispers in the saloon and the barber shop. "It does not matter what the brat looks like," Wallace hissed to anyone who would listen. "The law is the law. I have heard from a solicitor in St. Louis. Mrs. Hale's cousin, the real Mrs. Hale, is coming in the spring. She intends to contest the will. She claims the doctor was not of sound mind when he married that woman. Undue influence. She tricked a dying man. He made his boldest move on a Saturday. standing on the boardwalk in front of his store as Lena rode past on her mare. "Enjoy the horse while you can, girl," Wallace shouted. "When the probate court is done with you, you won't even own the clothes on your back. No court in Wyoming will give a medical practice to a woman like you." Lena did not stop. She kept her eyes forward, her spine rigid. But when she got home, she collapsed into a chair, shaking. Nate found her there. He was weaker now, spending more days in bed than out of it. The winter had taken a toll that spring would not repay. But when he heard what Wallace had said, a cold fire lit in his eyes. "Help me up," he said. "Nate, you cannot—" Lena protested. "You have a fever." "I said help me up," he commanded. "Send for Miller, and send word to Wallace and the town council. I want them in the clinic, tomorrow at noon." The meeting was small, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Sheriff Miller stood by the door. Wallace stood near the window, looking smug. The Reverend, the blacksmith, and 2 ranchers, including old Elias Thorne, sat on the benches. Nate sat in his chair behind the desk. He was wearing his best suit, though the collar was loose around his neck. He looked like a corpse that had refused to lie down. Lena stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Mr. Wallace seems to be under the impression," Nate began, his voice low but cutting through the silence, "that my affairs are open for debate." "Now, Nate, we are just looking out for you," Wallace said smoothly. "We know you are not yourself. This woman," Nate interrupted, slamming his hand on the desk, "is my wife." He pulled a document from the drawer. It was the affidavit he had signed with the judge. "This is a legal declaration of paternity and a last will and testament," Nate said, holding it up. "It states clearly that I, Nathaniel Hale, being of sound mind, leave all earthly possessions to my wife, Maria Elena Hale, and our son, William. It acknowledges William as my legitimate issue. It is witnessed by the sheriff and sealed by the circuit court." He looked at Wallace, his gray eyes blazing. "There is no cousin coming. Wallace, I wrote to Elizabeth's family myself. They sent a letter of congratulations on the birth. You are a liar." Wallace flushed purple. "Paperwork. A judge can overturn it if he knows the character of the beneficiary. You are leaving a medical practice to a laundress." "I am leaving it to the person who has been running it for 6 months, Nate shouted, then broke off into a violent coughing fit. Lena handed him a handkerchief, her face stony. "She knows more about healing than you know about cheating scales." "Wallace," Nate wheezed when he could speak. "It is not right," Wallace muttered, looking around the room for support. "It goes against decency." Silence stretched in the room. Then, a voice spoke from the back. It was Maud, the wife of a sheep rancher, a woman with skin like dried apples and hands like roots. "I do not give a damn about decency," Maud said. She stood up. "Last month, when my boy got bit by that rattler. It was midnight. The doc here couldn't even stand up. It was Lena who rode out. She cut the wound. She sucked the poison. She stayed awake for 2 days, dripping water into his mouth." Maud looked at Wallace. "My boy is alive. If Lena hadn't been there, he would be dead. As far as I am concerned, she is the doctor's wife, and she has earned her place. You touch her, Wallace, and you answer to me." Elias Thorne nodded. "Same here. She set my mule's leg when the vet was drunk. She has good hands." The mood in the room shifted. It was a physical thing, like the breaking of a fever. The men looked at Lena, really looked at her, and saw not the saloon girl, but the woman who had faced the blizzard and the sickness and the judgment, and had not broken. Wallace looked around, saw he was beaten, and stormed out, the bell on the door jangling angrily. Nate slumped back in his chair, exhausted. He reached up and covered Lena's hand with his own. "It is done," he whispered. The months that followed were a gift they had not expected to receive. Nate did not get better, but he stopped getting worse. He reached a fragile plateau, a truce with his own mortality. He could not ride, and he could not exert himself, but he could live. He spent his days in the clinic, teaching Lena. He taught her the Latin names of bones. He taught her how to mix laudanum and digitalis. He taught her how to listen to a chest and hear the difference between fluid and constriction. And in the evenings, the house was filled with a peace that felt miraculous. They would sit by the fire, the baby playing on the rug between them. William was a sturdy child, crawling with a determined energy, pulling himself up on the legs of Nate's chair. Nate would reach down and lift the boy, his hands trembling slightly. He would hold William against his chest, closing his eyes, breathing in the scent of milk and new life. "He is growing so fast," Nate would say. "He will be walking by summer, and you will be there to see it," Lena would answer, looking up from her mending. They shared a deep, bittersweet intimacy. At night, in the dark of the bedroom, they held each other with a desperation that never quite faded. They knew that every night was stolen. They kissed slowly, savoring the taste of each other, whispering plans for a garden they might never plant, for a future Nate might not share. "If I go," Nate whispered one night, his head resting on her chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of her heart. "You must promise me something." "I am not promising anything," Lena said fiercely. "You are not going. Promise me," he insisted gently, "that you will not let them shame you, that you will raise him to be proud, and that you will remember you are the love of my life, not the consolation, the love." Lena wept then, silent tears that soaked his hair. "I promise." The seasons turned. Summer brought drought and dust, turning the sky a hazy yellow. Another fever swept through the valley, and this time, the town did not hesitate. They came to the door and asked for Mrs. Hale. Lena treated them, consulting Nate when she needed to, but doing the work herself, and Nate watched her. He sat on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket even in the heat, and watched his wife and son. He saw the way the town nodded to her. He saw the way William laughed, a sound that echoed off the distant blue hills. He lived to see William walk. He lived to see him run. He lived 4 years longer than any doctor had predicted, sustained by a stubborn refusal to leave the warmth of the world he had built. But the high plains are unforgiving, and time is a debt that must be paid. It happened in the deep of winter, 5 years after the blizzard. The wind was howling again, a familiar song. Nate woke in the middle of the night. He could not breathe. This time, there was no panic, just a quiet realization that the air was no longer enough. "Lena," he whispered. She was there instantly. She knew. She saw the change in his eyes, the gray veil falling over his face. She did not run for the medicine. She did not try to prop him up. She knew the signs. She simply climbed into the bed beside him, pulling his head onto her shoulder. "I am here," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I have you." "William," Nate breathed. "He is asleep. He is safe." Nate looked at her. His vision was dimming, the room narrowing to the point of light that was her face. He felt her hand in his, calloused and warm and strong. "My wife," he whispered. "My life." He closed his eyes. The struggle stopped. The rasping breath hitched, sighed, and then fell silent. Lena lay there for a long time, holding him as the warmth slowly left his body. She did not scream. She did not wail. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, whispered his name one last time, and then rose to cover the mirrors and stop the clock. The funeral was the largest Granite Springs had ever seen. They came from 50 miles away, ranchers, miners, shopkeepers. They stood in the snow, hats in hands. They did not come just for the doctor. They came for the family. They watched as the widow, standing tall and dry-eyed in her black dress, held the hand of a 5-year-old boy who looked exactly like his father. They watched as she threw the first handful of dirt onto the coffin. They watched as she turned and walked back to the carriage, her head high, the boy walking steadily beside her. 10 years later, the sun was setting over the valley, painting the sky in riotous shades of violet and gold. The wind tugged at the long grass on the rise above the town. Lena stood by the white picket fence that marked the grave. Her hair was streaked with gray now, tied back against the wind. Her hands were rougher, marked by years of work, years of healing. Below her, the town of Granite Springs had grown. There were brick buildings now, and telegraph lines stringing the sky. A church bell rang, clear and sweet. A wagon rattled down the road toward the clinic, where a sign swung in the breeze. M.E. Heir, healer midwife. Beside her stood a boy of 15. William was tall, gangly, with dark hair and gray eyes that looked at the horizon with a quiet intelligence. He held a medical book under his arm. "Mother," he said, "the kettle is boiling." "I am coming." "Will," Lena said. She looked down at the grave one last time. The stone was simple. Nathaniel Heir, beloved husband and father. He healed others. She healed him. She looked at the town that had tried to push her out, the town that now tipped its hat to her. She looked at the son who carried Nate's blood in her spirit. She whispered to the wind, a secret shared between her and the ghost who still walked these hills. "You were wrong, my love," she said softly. "You were never cursed. We carved this out. We made it real." She turned from the grave. She put her hand on her son's shoulder, feeling the solid, living warmth of him. "Come," she said. "We have work to do." They walked down the hill together, two figures silhouetted against the vast, enduring sky of the west, walking back to the house that love had built, leaving the darkness behind them. Thank you for journeying with us to the high plains of Granite Springs. It has been a privilege to tell the story of Nate and Lena, a tale of love that bloomed in the harshest of winters and defied the odds of its time. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Did the ending resonate with you? Where are you listening from today? Please share your location and your reflections in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit, romance, and the untamed American frontier, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West. Your support keeps these fires burning. Until the next trail, stay safe.